All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. I just wanted to say thank you all for joining us. My name is Brady Burns, and I serve as the NRMN Digital Communications Strategist. And this is the National Research Mentoring Network's Career Development Webinar, Best Practices for Junior Investigators when Writing an NIH Research Grant Application. And this is presented by Dr. Jaime S. Rubin. And we're so very excited to have her with us today. And we're also excited to have you here today. And I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping rules before we begin. And yes, I can repeat that. My name is Brady Burns. I serve as the NRMN Digital Communications Strategist, and we're here to present to you today best practices for junior investigators when writing an NIH research grant application by Dr. Jaime S. Rubin. And I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping rules before we get started. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and uploading to our YouTube channel following the event. You'll find a link to our YouTube channel that I'm about to post in the chat right now. So you can use that to direct link to our YouTube channel that we will post this to following the event. You will also be sent this video recording following the event to the email account that you use to register for this webinar. If you should have any questions for Dr. Rubin during the course of this presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A feature and not the chat feature so that we can still submit information to you in the chat and that we can also get your questions answered at the end of our program. Dr. Rubin may also stop during the presentation to ask for questions, so feel free to post those then as well. Thank you again for joining us, and I just wanted to briefly go over the National Research Mentoring Network and who we are and what we stand for. So the National Research Mentoring Network, NRMN, is an NIH grant-funded initiative whose entire purpose is to diversify the STEM workforce. And we started in 2014, and we now have over 18,000 mentors and mentees in our network. For more information about NRMN, you can actually visit our website, and I will post that into the chat now. And you can also join our network by visiting the link that I'm about to post in the chat as well. And so those links are nrmnet.net for our website and my.nrmnet.net for our network. I would now like to introduce our esteemed presenter today, Dr. Jaime S. Rubin. Dr. Rubin is the Vice Chair for Investigator Development in the Department of Medicine at Columbia University Medical Center. She's here to talk to you all about NIH research grant application components, specific content that should be included, and the NIH research grant review process, scoring system, and review criteria. So I know we're all very excited to start this presentation. And without further ado, I would like to pass it over to Dr. Rubin.
Thank you, Brady. Just a couple of opening comments. I just want to thank the National Research Mentoring Network and Brady and the whole team for sponsoring and hosting this session today. And I just wanted to thank all of you for joining us and hope that during this period, you all and your family and friends are doing well. So let me start by sharing my screen and the sort of formal presentation of the slides. Brady, if you could just let me know with a thumbs up. Can you see the slides? Okay, great, thank you. So as Brady said, the title of today's presentation is Best Practices for Junior Investigators when Writing a Competitive NIH Research Grant Application. And I happen to teach a course on related topics at Columbia. And so all the material that I'm going to show today, plus has been posted to the webpage for my course, grantscourse.columbia.edu, and you can see the URL at the bottom of that first slide. So I always start every presentation with an outline, a list of sort of a table of contents of what I'm going to discuss. And it's also to remind me to remind you that it's always good to start every grant application with an outline of the topics that you want to discuss within each of the components of the application. With regard to the first topic, NIH has had a long-standing interest in supporting enhancing diversity in the biomedical workforce. As you can see, they came out with a very recent notice along with this. Also released in the NIH guide, what they call a request for information. And this shows you the title there. Requesting comments and suggestions on how to advance and strengthen racial equity, diversity, and inclusion in the biomedical research workforce, and advance health disparities and health equity research, in case anybody wants to comment or add suggestions. It's open for about another month or so. NIH has also had a long-standing statement on diversity, NIH's ability to help ensure that the nation remains a global leader in scientific discovery and innovation is dependent upon a pool of highly talented scientists from diverse backgrounds who will help to further NIH's mission. They emphasize that scientists and trainees from diverse backgrounds and life experiences bring different perspectives, creativity, and individual expertise to address complex scientific problems. Within this notice, they list different categories in terms of underrepresented populations. In the research enterprise, individuals from racial and ethnic groups, and they go on to say that that can vary from setting to setting. Individuals with disabilities, individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds, and also women for faculty level diversity targeted programs. And with regard to individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds, they have recently expanded the definition to be more inclusive in terms of individuals that would meet this new definition. NIH has a Trans NIH Multi-Institute Diversity Program Consortium, highlighting programs to enhance diversity in the biomedical workforce. Ultimately, these efforts will help to engage a more diverse field of individuals in biomedical research careers. And of course, the National Research Mentoring, the host of today's session, is a major component of this consortium. So NIH has a number of different funding programs to enhance diversity in the biomedical workforce. There are funding programs for institutions, there are funding programs for individuals, but I'd like to highlight this one program, especially with regard to the material that I'm going to discuss today. And this has to do with research supplements to existing grants. So if an individual has their own research grant or cooperative agreement, some other research funding from the NIH, the principal investigator can receive additional funding, which is called a supplement, to support a specific individual to work on a specific aspect of that research project. Excuse me, this individual can be a high school student all the way up to the faculty level. And so this is to enable these individuals to join an ongoing and funded research project, especially relevant to the material I'm going to discuss in a few minutes. As you can see, this is a funding announcement where all the different NIH institutes are listed, and one should contact the contact, if you will, from each of the different institutes if you're going to apply. Because some of them they have different deadlines. Some might focus their money on undergraduates, some might focus their funding on faculty level individuals. But this program, these research supplements to promote diversity, is an NIH wide funding program that if you have a research mentor, if you meet the definition for diversity, I would really strongly encourage individuals to follow through. So now to discuss the NIH research grant funding mechanism, what they call the R01. This is my little schematic representation of the NIH. And you can see that it's the National Institutes of health. There's an S at the end of institute, where there are different institutes. Most, no, not all, are focused on different disease areas. There's a National Cancer Institute, there's the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and so forth. And I put a circle around that center at the bottom, the Center for Scientific Review, to remind me to highlight to you that in many cases, the R01, the research grants, are not reviewed at the Institute. Now, the Institute might put up the funding, they put up the support, they determine which grants to be funded, but the review process goes on outside of the Institute at the Center for Scientific Review. And within the Center for Scientific Review, there are 100 or so different study sections or review committees. And this is where your R01 grant will be reviewed and scored. It's very important to make sure that you steer or request that your grant be reviewed at the most appropriate study section, where the reviewers have the most appropriate background and expertise to understand what you're proposing and why it's so important. And I will discuss later how you can help try to get the most informed review for your research grant so that it's reviewed at the most appropriate study section. This is the NIH budget over 2019, and we're going to be focused on this dark blue area of the funding for the research grants, the majority of NIH's budget, as you can see. So NIH has three main different types of funding mechanisms: the grant, the cooperative agreement, and the contract. And the R01 that we're going to discuss today is a grant. And if you will, it has the most amount of sort of flexibility, if you will, where it's investigator initiated, that's the term, where the investigator determines what they want to study and how they want, what questions they want to ask, and how are they going to answer those questions. Now, this R01 application that I'm going to discuss in a very granular level is a model for other types of research grant applications. It's a model for other types of NIH research grant applications, like the smaller R03, which usually provides $50,000 a year over 2 years, or the R21, which usually provides $275,000 over 2 years, and these larger, very large P01 programs, which many times is sort of a connection between 3 or more R01 types projects. As well, the R01 can be used as a model, if you will, or the approach to developing a competitive R01 application can also be used, the same skill set, when developing research grant applications for other funding agencies, non-government agencies, as I've listed here. Give you an idea of the success rate and the number of awards. So this is a chart from NIH where the dark blue is the number of applications over time, the lighter blue is the number of awards, and the red obviously is the success rate, the number of awards divided by the number of applications in this case. So this is the information on a much more granular level, but I think there's a couple of interesting points that I want to make that this chart shows. And there's a tremendous amount of data on NIH's webpage. So one of the first things to know is that with NIH, one of the neat things of their grant process is if you don't get funded the first time, you can then submit what's called the resubmission or an amended application. So there, the A1 signifies the first amended application. And in that amended application, in that resubmission, you would address and respond to all of the reviewers' comments that you received in response to that first submission, that A0 application. You can see the very significant change in the success rate from 14.8% to 31.1% between the initial application and those that submitted resubmissions, amended applications demonstrating that they must have very comprehensively responded to the reviewers' comments. The other neat thing about NIH is that, let's say you get a grant and it's for 4 or 5 years, you can then submit after the 4 or 5 years are up, what's called a competing continuation. So you've got the grant for 4 or 5 years, and now you're asking for another 4 or 5 years. And in that competing continuation, you would talk about your productivity and all the exciting findings that you had in papers published during that initial 5 years, and then the exciting ideas that you have proposed for the second 5 years. And this shows you the difference in the success rate for these competing continuations. So the R01 supports a specific discrete project, and it's focused around this formal term of specific aims, which I'm going to discuss further. And it should provide, and you should request, funding to sort of comprehensively support the research that you're going to propose. I'm going to show a little bit later, one does not need to submit a detailed budget if you are requesting $250,000 or less in direct cost every year. Multi-year, they're usually for 4 or 5 years. There's some amount of flexibility in how the funding is spent, as long as you are still addressing those specific aims that were funded in that initial application. And as you can see in the last bullet, this term of investigator-initiated research. In terms of what does the funding provide? It provides for your salary for the percent effort that you are dedicating to that project. 30% effort, then it would pay for 30% of the salary in most cases. The other research personnel, the students working with you, the postdocs, the research techs, any collaborators or co-investigators, the supplies that you need, the plasticware, whatever, if you're doing research with animals or you're doing research with human subjects, any core facilities that are doing some of the testing, or any equipment that you're using from core facilities, travel, which I hope we start doing again soon, to national conferences to present the results of this NIH-funded research. As I said, they're usually for 4 or 5 years, and they're renewable. So the example I gave at the bottom, so let's say you got the original grant for 5 years and you successfully renewed the grant twice for another 2 times 5 years. So then you have the grant for the total of 15 years, which is really quite impressive. In terms of how do you find out about funding opportunities, or how does one respond to a funding announcement? So NIH, in this sort of pyramid, has different types of funding announcements with increasing specificity in terms of the research that they're willing to fund. At the very bottom of this pyramid, and in a very general sense, is what they call the parent announcement. So there's just a parent announcement for the R01 or a parent announcement for the R03, and there's really no specificity in what types of research it's the program would fund. Moving up the pyramid, NIH has now started to issue what they call NOSIs, or Notices of Special Interest, where they are now talking about specific areas of research that they want to fund with the R01 mechanism or the R03 mechanism. We're interested in, I don't know, maternal health, any topic that you can think of. They would then issue a notice of special interest that they're interested in funding using one of their different funding mechanisms. Moving up the pyramid, they have some special program announcements, PARs, or special review. Many times it's reviewed not at the Center for Scientific Review, but at the Institute itself, or PAS, where they have set aside funds specifically to support X number of awards that were made in response to this particular PAS funding announcement. And then at the top of the pyramid is the very specific RFA, or request for application and targeted research program, where if you read the RFA funding announcement, NIH is very specific about the type of applications that they want to see, the specific aims that they want to see in these applications. And they have dedicated X amount of dollars, if you will, with the expectation of funding Y number of awards. So it's important when you respond to a particular funding announcement to understand what type of funding announcement it is. And this is just an example of a listing of the parent announcements for the R01 application, the most recent funding announcements. And there are three types, as you can see. One, clinical trial not allowed at the top, clinical trial required at the bottom, and in the middle, a new type, what's called BESH, or basic experimental studies with human subjects. Most investigators, especially those not doing research with human subjects, bench scientists, translational research, use 20-185, the parent R01 clinical trial not allowed. So what are the deadline dates for NIH applications? So for new R01 applications, there are 3 cycles a year, as you can see, February 5th, June 5th, and October 5th. That's one of the unusual things about NIH. Some other funding agencies have 1 deadline a year, maybe 2. We're lucky that NIH has 3. For the R03 and the R21, those smaller grant mechanisms, it's a couple of weeks later, if you will, February 16th, June 16th, and October 16th. Now, these are for new applications. Now, if you were submitting instead a renewal application, a competing renewal, or a resubmission because you didn't get funded the first time, it's 1 month later, March 5th, July 5th, and November 5th. And similarly for the R03 and the R21, it's 1 month later, March 16th, July 16th, and November 16th. And remember, these are for competing renewals or resubmissions where you're responding to reviewers' comments because you didn't get funded the first time. AIDS applications have their own set of deadlines. So what does the application cycle look like? So let's look at cycle 3. So let's say you applied for one of the October deadline or the November deadline. There's usually sort of 3 milestone points, each 3 months apart. So 3 months after you submit the grant, roughly 3 months, the grant is reviewed at NIH by one of these study sections, many times at the Center for Scientific Review. About 3 months later, the specific NIH institute, the Cancer Institute, the Eye Institute, the council or advisory body of that institute looks at all the grant applications, all the scores, how much funding they have, and makes a decision about the pay line and what grants they can fund and what grants they cannot fund. And let's say yours is one of those that's above the pay line and is going to get funded. And then about 3 months later, after some administrative details are taken care of, NIH will issue what's called the Notice of Grant Award, officially starting your grant and supplying funding. So it's about a 9-month process, as you can see. If you apply for one of the October or November deadlines, you're going to get funded at around July 1st of the following year. Now, this is a very old slide. There are some problems with the slide, but I made a copy of this from some hard copy information I got from NIH a number of years ago, but I think it very clearly shows sort of the path of an application, of an investigator-initiated application. So when the application is submitted to NIH and it goes to the Center for Scientific Review, and there are 2 decisions that are made. One is, what institute will fund the grant if it gets an appropriate score? Cancer Institute, heart, lung, and blood, diabetes and digestive and kidney diseases. And also, very importantly, what study section, what review committee will review that grant? We're going to discuss how to make sure that your grant gets to the right study section or helps to ensure that it will get to the right study section. All right, so moving to the next section, what happens when the grant is reviewed at a study section? What happens when the grant is reviewed by the reviewers? So there are what's called the impact score or the overall impact score. It's 1 to 9 whole integers. So this is one of NIH's representation. This chart is a little bit more informative, talking about what makes something an exceptional grant, an outstanding grant, an excellent grant. In the high impact range, though the lower the impact score, the better the grant is reviewed, 1 being the best and 9 being the poorest. More information from NIH, I would say that generally speaking, one tries to get overall impact score in the high range, 1, 2, or 3, for having a chance of getting funded. So the reviewers who have been assigned the grant give an overall preliminary impact score. And the grants that are in the top half, if you will, roughly speaking, at a study section will be discussed at study section. The grants that the assigned reviewers find are in the bottom 50% will not be discussed at study section. Now, these grants that are not discussed will still get their full 10-page, if you will, reviewers' comments. If it's an initial application, the applicant can still take these comments, respond to them adequately, and go in and submit a resubmitted grant. They will not get an overall impact score, but they will get what I would call sub-impact scores, if you will, for the different components, which I'm going to show you. But they will not get an overall impact score because the grant is not reviewed at study section. And over there, the bottom 2 bullets is the overall impact score, which is the mean of all of the impact scores received by the whole review committee. And I just want to emphasize that they take this mean and then they multiply by 10. So let's say you look at your score and it's a 22, let's say. Well, you could say, how can it possibly get a 22? I thought it only goes from 1 to 9. But really, the mean was 2.2, which means that you probably got a mixture of 2s and 3s impact scores, meaned out, averaged out to 2.2, and then it's multiplied by 10. So remember that, multiplied by 10. So a number of years ago, NIH recognized that junior investigators are having a hard time getting funded as compared to established investigators. So they created this special category of early stage investigator, or ESI. And these are individuals who haven't received an R01 grant, though they might have received a smaller research grant or a fellowship, or a career development grant, or an NIH loan repayment program. Does not make them ineligible for ESI status. These are individuals that are within 10 years of their terminal research degree or completing their medical residency. Extensions are permitted and are given not infrequently, many times for, let's say, the clinical years of a clinical fellowship. Childbirth within the ESI period. NIH has now said they will give everybody an extension for 1 year. So if you meet these criteria for early stage investigator, my suggestion is that you go into your NIH Commons site, and I'm going to show that in a little bit, fill out your personal profile and the education section. This is how NIH determines whether somebody is an ESI and the end date of their ESI status. And it's very important, as you're going to see in a second, that if you meet the ESI criteria, your grants are tagged as having an ESI principal investigator. So here's an example from the last fiscal year of the pay line from the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. So for established investigators, the pay line was at the 16th percentile. and look at the difference that they give for the early stage investigators. That is a very significant change in pay line for the early stage investigators. So this very dramatically shows that individuals that meet the ESI criteria should make sure that it is noted in their profile section of their NIH Commons site. Moving right along to just to flow through in terms of the NIH grant review criteria. So whenever I give a talk about how to complete an NIH grant application or any type of grant application, I always speak first about the review criteria, because it's critical that applicants know and understand what the review criteria are. What are the criteria that the reviewers have been given on which they're going to base their review, on which they are going to base their scores, so that when we discuss next the different components of the application, you're writing the different components of the grant application. You're thinking about the different components, how to develop the different components, and what points to touch on, knowing what the review criteria are. It doesn't make sense to do these bullet points 4 and 5 in the opposite order, right? You want to know what the reviewer criteria are as you begin to think about the different components and what should go in the different components. So as I said, at the review committee, about half the grants are discussed, about half the grants are not discussed. However, the assigned reviewers, even for the not discussed grants, still write up their reviews. They still talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the different review criteria. They still give what I call sub-impact scores for these different review criteria. It's very detailed, and applicants can still take these review criteria and go in and submit a resubmission application addressing the review criteria, even though they're not discussed at study section. Those that aren't discussed at study section will get an overall impact score, as I said, which is the mean of the impact scores from all of the other reviewers. So I'm going to talk specifically about the review criteria, and I'm going to use, as you can see in the bottom, the review criteria that's listed, that's described in detail in that parent announcement I highlighted before, the parent announcement for the non-clinical trial R01. So reviewers are to provide an overall impact score to reflect their assessment of the likelihood for the project to exert a sustained and powerful influence on the field. I will say that though they give sub-impact scores, if you will, for the core review criteria that I'm going to discuss, their overall impact score is not necessarily an average of the sub-impact scores. They might give different emphasis to different components. So what are these core review criteria? 5 main core review criteria: significance, investigators, innovation, approach, and environment. They used to have this page up on the web, but this is basically what they would fill out: bullet points listing the strengths and the weaknesses in each of these core areas. Even if the grant is not discussed at study section, you would still get this document with these bullet point strengths and weaknesses. So what are the different areas that the reviewers are looking for in terms of significance? Does the project address an important problem or critical barrier? Is it important? NIH is, and I'm going to touch on this a number of times, is putting more emphasis on rigor, reproducibility, and transparency. And part of that is that the applicants need to discuss the prior research. And is the prior research that they're basing their research on rigorous? I mean, the prior research is sort of the foundation of what you're proposing. So is the foundation that you're on that's forming the basis of what you're proposing, is it a strong foundation or is it a weak foundation? Is it rigorous? And if there are problems with the foundation, if you will, the prior research, how are you going to mitigate that? What aspects are going to be changed or achieved or approved if your research is successful in terms of scientific knowledge, technical capability, or clinical practice? How will this change different aspects of your field, concepts, methodologies, technologies, clinical treatment, services, preventive interventions? What impact is your research going to have in your field? In terms of the investigative team, so it's not only you as the principal investigator, but it's also your collaborators and co-investigators and the other members of your research team. How are you well suited to this project? Do you have the expertise and the background? If you're an early stage investigator or other members of your team are early stage investigators or at other early stages of their careers, you need to demonstrate that you, even though you're an early stage or a junior investigator, you have the appropriate experience and training and background to do what you're proposing. If somebody isn't established, do they have a track record of accomplishments in this field? Do they have publications? Have they been involved in other peer review funding or any other NIH funding or projects? If it's collaborative or multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, or there's more than one principal investigator, which we're going to talk about, what's the governance or the organizational structure if there are many senior individuals involved in leading the project? Now, it's good if the project is collaborative or it's interdisciplinary or it's multidisciplinary. You just need to demonstrate how you as the PI can lead some kind of complex project. And innovation, very important, okay? How is your project basically innovative? How does your project challenge existing current research or clinical practice? One of the terms is, paradigm shifting. How does your project, how do you demonstrate that you're going to use novel concepts or novel approaches or novel methodologies or instrumentations or interventions? That it's just not more of the same. Your project really is novel in your field of research, or novel in a broad sense. Is it novel in a very significant way, or is it a refinement or improvement or new application of an existing approach or methodology? Exactly how is what you're proposing going to move your field forward? And then the approach is very important. So what is your overall strategy, methodology to do this research? What's the analysis that you're going to use on the data that's obtained? All of this is going to be tied to the specific aims that you're going to propose, which I'm going to get to in a little bit. And as I mentioned about NIH's emphasis on rigor, reproducibility, and transparency, identify what are the weaknesses of the rigor in the prior research or the foundation that you're building your research on, and how are you going to address or mitigate this weakness? And then in terms of your research that you're proposing, to demonstrate that it's robust and it will lead to an unbiased approach. And I think as a junior investigator, you can demonstrate maturity on your part as a junior investigator, as a new independent investigator, by recognizing that there might be potential problems. I like the term challenges associated with what you're proposing, and then to talk about alternative strategies, how you would address any potential problems or challenges alternate approaches that you would use to deal with, to mitigate any potential problems, okay? It's also important to establish feasibility of the project, that the project is doable, especially if there's any risky aspects. And especially as a junior investigator, as the new investigator, to establish that you can do the project, that you can demonstrate feasibility. I will say that preliminary data and having strong preliminary data addresses this point. And also falling within rigor and reproducibility is addressing any relevant biological variables, such as sex, as a biological variable. If you're doing research with human subjects, which I'm going to touch on, key points, the protection of human subjects involved in the research, any inclusion or exclusion criteria for the human subjects in the study. NIH now is putting an emphasis on individuals across the lifespan. It used to be children, and now they are focusing on children and older adults, the term across the lifespan. And also the environment, to demonstrate that where you're proposing to do the research, your institution has everything you need to do the research. You have the bench research, you have the patient population, you have the history of recruiting and retaining from that patient population, any specialized piece of equipment or core facility, such that as soon as that notice of grant award is issued, you can get started on the research because you have everything you need to get that research done at that institution. Additional review criteria, which I'm going to touch on, which the reviewers also discuss, which the reviewers also address in their review. There's the term individuals across the lifespan. And I just want to emphasize the resubmissions to make sure that if you don't get funded the first time and you need to submit a resubmission, that you comprehensively respond to the reviewer's comments from that first review. Other review considerations, which I'm going to touch on. And I just wanted to also emphasize the budget and period of support. Many times applications from new investigators are overly ambitious. They have proposed something that's outside the scope of that funding mechanism. It would require too much money or too much time. So make sure that what you propose matches the budget and matches the period of support. These are a number of the other bullet items that reviewers will look at, as I mentioned, vertebrate animals, human subjects, budget information, and so forth. And at this URL is all of the guidelines that the reviewers are given when considering each of these topics. Similarly, additional information for different types of funding mechanisms. So today we're talking about research grants, and we're talking specifically about R01, the R01 guide for reviewers. So it's not only this information, it's also the information spelled out in detail in that funding announcement. And the information that I just presented is specifically from the funding announcement, the parent R01 for non-clinical trial. And for those of you that might be proposing research that involves a clinical trial, you need to use a funding opportunity announcement, an FOA that will accept clinical trials. And also there are additional review criteria, obviously, if the research involves a clinical trial. So I've talked and mentioned a couple of times of this increased interest and emphasis on rigor and reproducibility and transparency in the proposed research. And there are sort of four main areas that you should address and be thinking about when you're writing a grant application. The rigor of the prior research, the rigor of what you're proposing for your experimental design and to demonstrate that it will result in unbiased results, consideration of relevant biological variables like sex as a biological variable, and authentication of key biological or chemical resources. And I'm going to talk about what I mean in each of these areas, because I think there's increasing emphasis on all of this. So where would you address each of these 4 items? The rigor of the prior research, you would discuss in the significance and approach section. The scientific rigor of what you're proposing would be in the approach section. The consideration of relevant biological variables such as sex would be the approach section. And the authentication of key biological and or chemical resources has its own section, as I'm going to show you. They have a lot of good information up, a lot of good FAQs, as you can see, for each of these 4 areas. And I would suggest that you read all of this background information as you begin to develop your application. Okay, let me just stop and take a sip of water if you don't mind. Thank you. Sorry about that. So taking what we know now about the review criteria, how do we relate that to the components of the NIH R01 grant application? So first of all, make sure that you're using the most current instructions. So here you can see we're in version F, though I think we might be moving to version G in the near future. Just make sure that you're using the current version. This is a PDF version. They also have an HTML version, which I like to use because it's easy to move back and forth and to search and so forth. They have a very good web page that talks about the page limits for each of the different sections. So the abstract, 30 lines, something called a project narrative. And we're going to go through this. The specific aims, which was, I would say, the single most important page in the application, is 1 page. The biographical sketch, which they just last week, and I'm going to cover, issued new rules or guidelines for the biosketch. In terms of the research strategy, which is really the core, of course, of the research grant application. So it's the 1-page specific aim. For the smaller grants, it's 6 pages for the research strategy. And for the R01, it's 12 pages. And this really, the 1 + 6 or the 1 + 12, is really the core of the application. All of this can be superseded if there are additional instructions in the specific funding opportunity or FOA funding opportunity announcement that you are responding to. So let's just go through the application sort of page by page. This is sort of the cover page, and I'm sure you will all work with your department or institute or center's research administration to help fill out these kinds of institutional fields. But I just wanted to highlight number 11 down there, which is the title, and to really think carefully about what the title is of the grant. This is the first thing that the reviewers are going to read. So you can really capture their attention or not from this one piece of information. I would say go and look at the titles of other successful funded grants. The title of a research grant is not really the same thing as the title of a journal article. They try to address different points. Look at like an NIH Reporter, which is their online database of successful funded grants. See what the titles are of other grant applications, or specifically other grant applications in your field. This page is about you as the principal investigator, and hopefully your research administrator will help you complete this page. Now there's a cover letter attachment, and generally speaking, the cover letter attachment is not a requirement for research grants. It is a requirement for Ks, career development, or Fs, fellowships. But there are some cases, as I've listed here, when you are required to include a cover letter. It is an administrative document seen by the administrators at NIH. It is not a document that's seen by the reviewers. It used to be in this cover letter. This is where the principal investigator would request a specific institute to fund their grant or a specific study section to review their grant. This is no longer in the cover letter. There is now a form called the PHS assignment request form. It is technically optional. It is not a requirement, but I really strongly suggest everybody to fill it out. And there's 4 main sections. So the first part is the awarding component. So what institute? Heart, lung, and blood, general medical sciences, and so forth, aging. And then what study section? So do your homework, look up the different study sections and what their purview is. Look up who's serving on the study section, and then make sure, and then you can give a reason at the very bottom, tying the purview of that particular study section's charge with your specific aims to help make sure that the grant goes to the study section where the reviewers have the most appropriate expertise, and thus you could get the fairer review. And finally, that 4th section here, those 5 boxes where you can put in keywords or keyword phrases about your application. It's about imaging, or bioinformatics, patient-oriented, just sort of making up things. So even though you might get the grant and it goes to the right review committee, well, it's still fairly heterogeneous among the 20, 25 or whatever people serving on that study section. You want to steer the grant to the individuals that have the best scientific background for your grant so that you could get the most informed review. Cover page supplement. Now, a lot of this is yes, no questions, and hopefully you have a research administrators that can help you fill it out. Are animals involved? Are they euthanized? Are human embryonic stem cells involved? Which cell lines? Is human fetal tissue involved in the study? The project site or performance site. So there's the primary location, which is most likely your institution, and your research administrator can help you fill this out. Now, in some cases, there might be another location. You might have co-investigators or collaborators who are at other institutions. It's a little confusing, but there would be site location number 1, which would be the information about your collaborators or co-investigators if they're doing part of the work and they're at another institution. And so, as I said, your institution, the collaborating institution, and then later on in the application, there's a facilities and resources section, and you're going to discuss the available facilities and resources in support of the research, both at your institution as well as any of the collaborating institutions. Other project information, human subjects involved, yes or no, animals involved, yes or no. Let me just say that with regard to research with human subjects, many times people get in trouble here. They're working with research, they're working with a tissue of human origin, for example. They don't think it's research with human subjects. That's not necessarily the case. It might meet the definition of research with human subjects. It might meet the definition of exempt. Go to your IRB, your institutional review board that makes these determinations, and let them determine whether what you're proposing meets the definition of doing research with human subjects, if it's exempt, and what exempt number if it is exempt. It's very hard for you to make the determination. I have gotten phone calls more than once on the day of the deadline with somebody saying, I think I'm doing research with human subjects. Are you doing research with a collaborator or partner that's outside of the United States? So it's not only yes or no, you should answer the question, but you should answer the question and you have to include this additional document. If there is a non-US institution involved, you need to include this other document describing why you've chosen to work with this other foreign institution and bring them into your research project. There is no special line to upload this document, so you would upload it into number 12, other attachments. So moving right along with this page, project summary abstract. Spend a lot of time on the project summary or the abstract. When the grant is funded, this is what's going to get posted to NIH Reporter. you're allowed 30 lines of text. Many times, this is the second thing that the reviewers are going to read, the title and then the abstract. Unfortunately, sometimes people save this to the very end and they're sort of sick of writing the grant application or at the day of the deadline, and they sort of cut and paste sentences from different places in the application. Don't do that. Spend a fair amount of time reading this because it can have an impact on first impressions on the reviewer. So spend some time on this. The project narrative is 2 to 3 sentences. It's usually written in lay language. This will also go up in NIH Reporter describing the relevance of what you're proposing to public health. The bibliography or the references cited. So what you're going to be discussing later on should not be a review article. However, you should, reference and cite your publications and the publications of others that support what you're proposing. There is no page limit for this section. Facilities and other resources. Those purple bullets, if you will, they used to be a form, and these are the different categories that used to be on the form. Some individuals still follow that format, if you will. And for each performance site at your institution, collaborators at other institutions, you want to talk about all of the resources and facilities that the investigators have access to, demonstrating that you can get the research done at that institution. You have the proper patient population, the proper animal colony, the proper specialized pieces of equipment or instrumentation or core facilities, just demonstrating that when the notice of grant award arrives, you can pretty much do the work because you have everything in place. Any unique needs to support your research, you should address it. If there are any special biohazards involved, you want to address it. There is a section many times, I haven't seen it used that often, where early stage investigators can talk about institutional support to help them manage the grant, pre-award, post-award, and so forth. And equipment. So any pieces of equipment in your lab, down the hall in somebody else's lab that they'll give access to, or a core facility that houses the equipment, just demonstrating that you sort of an extension of the facilities, if you will, that you have access to everything you need to do the research. And other attachments. So I mentioned one other attachment just a little while ago in terms of any international institutions. There might be additional other attachments required for the specific funding announcement that you're responding to. Be cognizant of that. The research plan. So this is a very important part. I'm going to go through these sections. So first of all, the introduction is where you would respond to the reviewer's comments with your amended application if you didn't get funded the first time, this one-page introduction. Now, if it's the initial application, your first try, there is no introduction. And this research plan section is made up of 2 components, the 1-page specific aim and the 12 pages research strategy. So basically, you're answering the questions, these basic 4 questions. What do you intend to do? Why is it important? What's already been done in the field? And how are you going to do what you propose? The specific aims page is very important. I would say that the reviewers read the title, the abstract, and then the specific aims. If you wouldn't mind 1 second. So what are the goals of the proposed research? Summarize your expected outcomes and the impact of these outcomes on your field. I think it's very important many times for it to be hypothesis driven. So what are the hypotheses that you're testing? The specific problem to be addressed, any novel design or new technology that you're going to use, existing paradigm or clinical practice that's going to be challenged or shifted. Any critical barrier, existing critical barrier in your field and how your research is going to address that critical barrier. Some folks, not everybody, includes a figure in the specific aims page. Many times folks don't have room on that one page. And now the research strategy. So if there's more than one specific aim, you would address each of them in the research strategy. It's overall strategy, methodology, and analysis from sort of start to finish of the research project. Realizing that a lot of the details, if you're doing research with human subjects in terms of the eligibility, the demographics, the inclusion and exclusion criteria, will be in the human subjects section. 3 main sections to the research strategy: significance, innovation, and approach. And excuse me, this is where you will address all of the review criteria that we just discussed. This is where you would also include the preliminary studies or your pilot data. My general thought is, just as a general comment, that the more the preliminary data or preliminary studies that you have, the stronger the application. As a general statement, it demonstrates the feasibility of what you're proposing. It demonstrates that, well, the results look exciting. Look at the beginning experiments that we've done. It also demonstrates or enhances your credibility as a new investigator because you've done this preliminary work. 12 pages for an R01, 6 pages for an R03 or an R21. All right, so when you're writing these different sections, think about the review criteria that we just discussed. Demonstrating the importance of the particular problem that you're addressing, why it's providing or representing a critical barrier to progress in the field. Mention the strengths and weaknesses of the rigor of the prior research. We discussed this. If there are weaknesses in the prior research, how you're going to mitigate it, or how your preliminary data is helping to mitigate that, right? Because the prior research is the foundation for what you're proposing. So you don't want a shaky foundation, if you will. How the scientific knowledge or clinical practice in your field will be improved as a result of the research you're proposing, and how the current concepts, methods, technologies, treatment services, so forth, in your field will be impacted in a positive way, we hope, when your research is successful. So you're demonstrating the significance of your research project. And now innovation, right? Demonstrating that the research project is innovative, how it will change current thinking or paradigms in your field, any novel theoretical concepts, approaches that you're going to use or develop as compared to the current state, any improvements or new applications of current approaches and methodologies or interventions. So you're demonstrating how what you're proposing is so different and will have such a big impact on the current state of your field. All right, so moving along. The overall strategy, methodologies, and analyses to be used to accomplish your specific aims. You can see everything revolves around the specific aims. Many times the starting point when people begin to develop an R01 application is they spend weeks on the specific aims because everything else flows from the specific aims. How are you going to address or mitigate weaknesses in the rigor of the prior research? Demonstrating that what you're proposing for your research, your experimental design and methodology will lead to robust and unbiased results. How will you analyze and collect and interpret the data from your studies? And then, as we mentioned before, recognize any potential problems or challenges or limitations, how you ever want to use it, from what you're proposing, and what are the alternate strategies or approaches that you're going to use instead if you're confronted with any of these challenges or limitations. And what are the benchmarks or milestones that you're going to have along the way, along this 4 or 5 years, so that you can mark and note that, yes, you are on the right path. We expect to be at this point at 6 months. We expect to be at this point and have collected or developed this at the 18-month point. What are these benchmarks or milestones along the path? Sex is a biological variable, any relevant biological variables. This is part of NIH's growing importance of rigor, reproducibility, and transparency. It is evaluated by the reviewers. The involvement of human research subjects. And as I mentioned before, special review criteria and approach if you're doing research that involves a clinical trial. Sex is a biological variable. This is the guidance that's given to the reviewers when they're evaluating the study in terms of sex as a biological variable. Think about these things. Are there invertebrate animals or humans subjects involved in the study? No. But if the answer is yes, NIH has this very good decision tree, which you should look at, which is given to the reviewers. And you want to make sure that you are, come out on the strength point that you've addressed things. When NIH is telling the reviewers, if you look at the sort of orange no arrows, they lead to weaknesses, right? You don't want the reviewers to highlight any weaknesses in your research plan. This roadmap, if you will, or decision tree will allow you to think about how what you're proposing in your research plan will lead the reviewers to recognize as a strength in the research study as opposed to a weakness in the research study. Preliminary data, as I mentioned before, preliminary studies is always helpful. It assesses the likelihood of the project's success because it demonstrates feasibility. And especially you as a new investigator or early stage investigator, as well as your research team, demonstrates competence because you're able to come up with this preliminary work or these preliminary results and look at these results. They're exciting. You can then talk about how exciting these results are or novel and why you want to continue along this research path. Just to give you an idea that if you get the grant and then go in for a competing renewal after 4 or 5 years, one of the measures of productivity would be publications that came out of the previous research of the previous 4 or 5 years. Just to go through these other sections, if you will, vertebrate animals. For those of you that do research with vertebrate animals, you probably have an approved protocol from your Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee or IACUC, and you've probably already addressed and thought about these questions, the description of the procedures with the animals, the strains, the number of animals, and so forth, justifying the use of the species, and or whether the research can be done using computational methods, if you will. So justifying the numbers and the species and so forth, and minimizing any pain or distress in the course of the study. Select agent research. If any of you are doing research with select agents, you've probably been in contact with your biohazards committee at your institution. Multiple PI or leadership plan. So a number of years ago, NIH switched from only allowing one principal investigator or PI per grant to allowing more than one PI. Now, in some cases, this works very well. If the 2 or more PIs have complementary but different areas of expertise. There's a basic scientist and a clinical investigator, or somebody has expertise in one area and another one has expertise in a different area. So you bring your total expertise, integrated and complementary expertise, if you will, to lead the project. And in most cases, this is a strength, especially if the research is interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. In this section, you would talk about the different roles and responsibilities, the different resources, the budget to the different members of the MPIs, the different multiple PIs. So as I said, it can strengthen a multidisciplinary application. Both PIs don't have to be from the same institution. One individual, though, is called the contact MPI or contact PI. This is the sort of an administrative title where the notice of grant award would be issued in the name of that specific contact PI, even though there would be other MPIs listed. I showed you the different pay line from heart, lung, and blood between the 16th and the 26th percentile pay line. So for an application to get, if there's more than one PI, multiple PI, to get that special ESI pay line, all the MPIs would have to be ESIs to get that special pay line. Moving along. So suppose one of the investigators, one of the MPIs or one of the co-investigators is at another institution. They have a special expertise. They have a special research resource. That's fine. You would just set up what's called a consortium or subcontract arrangement between your institution, because you're the PI, and the institution of that other co-investigator. And the money would flow from NIH to your institution, which would then set up a subcontract with the institution of that other co-investigator, where you would provide funding from the Notice of Grant Award to support that co-investigator's piece of the work. It then allows you to find collaborators across the country who have expertise in the area that you need. You're not just need to rely on investigators at your institution if nobody has the appropriate expertise. So you would get a letter, there's sort of a form to fill out, signifying that that institution and that other investigator wants to enter into this kind of agreement post-award. You would get a collaborative letter of support from that individual that they're going to lead that aspect of the project. And you would also include their NIH biosketch in the application. So there's all sorts of letters of support that you would could include. So I mentioned the PI of a subcontract. You could include other collaborators, somebody that's going to provide some special research resource. They're going to send you some special cell line, if you will, or they're a referring physician and going to give you some, let's say, tissue samples of human origin. In some cases, not only would you include that individual's biosketch, but you might not only include a letter from that individual, but you can, depending upon their role, include their NIH biosketch. Maybe they're going to advise you on different aspects of the research. These are not supposed to be letters of reference like a fellowship application, but a letter in support of the research proposed. It cannot contain information. It's not a way of getting around the page limitations of the research plan. So it should not contain information that should be in the research plan section. So it looks like you're trying to get around the page limitation. The research sharing plan. There are some cases when you're required to submit different aspects in terms of sharing. So there's a data sharing plan requirement if you're asking for more than $500,000 a year in direct cost, if you're developing some different model organism, how you're going to share that. And if you're not going to share that, why aren't you going to share it? Realizing that the NIH funding is taxpayer supported. And then if you're doing some large scale human or non-human study that involves generating large scale genomic data, there's also a genomic data sharing requirements. But this is for very specific types of research. And moving right along, as I mentioned before, authentication of key biological and/or chemical resources is part of the emphasis on rigor, reproducibility, and transparency. This is a relatively new document. And this is where you would describe, and usually about one page is suggested, how you would validate any key biological or chemical resource that's used in the course of the research. What items should be discussed, right? So standard laboratory reagents, common biologicals and chemicals don't need to be included. But anything that might differ from lab to lab or might differ over time, where the qualities or qualifications could influence the research results and the research data, and are integral to proposed research, cell lines, antibodies, specialty chemicals, and so forth. And usually one page is recommended. The appendix. There's very little that's allowed in the appendix, unless there's something special listed in that particular funding announcement. And most applications, my guess, do not include an appendix material. It used to be that folks would include published papers or something like that. That is no longer allowed. So be very careful that you follow the instructions and don't include anything as an appendix that doesn't meet the requirements. Just to go through the human subjects and clinical trials information. So, and to make sure that you understand whether your research involves human subjects or not. The formal definition of research with human subjects. NIH has a formal definition of a clinical trial, and there's a wide range of clinical research that would meet NIH's definition of a clinical trial. There are 4 questions again in terms of that investigators should ask themselves in terms of what they're proposing, and then whether it would meet the definition of an NIH clinical trial. This is another decision tree, and here's the URL to help you decide when you're doing research with private information, or when you're doing research with biospecimens of human origin, whether you meet the definition of doing research with human subjects. My suggestion is, and I think this chart is very informative, but I think it helps to inform any discussion that you would have with the IRB. My suggestion is the IRB is most knowledgeable about research with human subjects and the requirements and the guidelines and the federal rules, and have them make the determination about whether you meet the definition of research with human subjects. Is it exempt? What's the exempt number? And so forth. If you need to fill out this form, there's a separate study record for each protocol. There are 5 main sections in this protocol. I just want to highlight a couple of them. One is the study population characteristics, and this is where you would talk about age and the inclusion and the exclusion criteria. And I wanted to highlight again, individuals across the lifespan, children as well as through to older adults, and also protection and monitoring plans. If you do research with human subjects and you have an IRB, a protocol, you've probably addressed these issues already. So you might have this information already on hand. You would just then include it in your NIH grant application. And another recent change to try and speed up clinical research is that if there's more than one domestic site doing the same research that has the same protocol, there would be one institution's IRB, many times the IRB of the principal investigator's institution, that will act as the IRB for the study when there's more than one domestic site involved. So this would be one IRB that would review the protocol and the consent form and so forth for that particular study. All right, so moving right along in terms of what are the different classifications of key personnel and the NIH biosketch. So you would fill out this form, and hopefully your research administrator would help you. You as the principal investigator, as the PI, as you see there with the red arrow. If there's more than one MPI, which we discussed, each of you would be listed as the principal investigator. The contact PI would be listed first. And then after the principal investigators are what's called the senior key person, number 1, number 2, and so forth. So these are individuals that contribute in a substantive and meaningful way to the scientific development or execution of the research that you're proposing. And this you would also include individuals who are from other institutions, like your collaborators at the subcontracts. And another key point about what defines somebody as a senior or key personnel is that they are not there on an as-needed basis or 0% effort. They are devoting measurable effort, 5%, 10%, 30%, whatever, to the research project. Excuse me, there are other individuals who are called other significant contributors. And these are people who might be an advisor or a referring physician or something like that, where they are not devoting measurable effort to the project. They're on, let's say, an as-needed basis. Somebody you can turn to every once in a while to ask them a question. You would also include their biosketch, and they would have one of these boxes, just like I discussed. And there you can see the project role. So my suggestion many times, there's a limited number of listed project roles. You might choose other, and then in the other project role category, describe what it is. They're the biostatistician, bioinformaticist, and so forth. So to make it somewhat informative for the reviewers. And you would attach everybody's biosketch here. So the new biosketch was just announced at the end of last week. So there is the URL, 5 pages total. And you would include the biosketch for all the key personnel, all the significant contributors, and so forth. And the reviewers use these biosketches to assess that investigator's background and qualifications for whatever they're going to do in the project, as well as the overall competence of the research team. Make sure that they're using the new and current biosketch. The new one goes into effect on May 25th of this year. Here is a note that a student received because one of the biosketches in his fellowship was not current and didn't have the right format. They could have not reviewed the grant. So make sure the biosketches that you get from these individuals are the right format and also are current. They don't have old information, has new publications and so forth. Different sections of the application of the biosketch, the education block, the personal statement, where they talk about themselves and their background and the expertise they have to do the specific role that's proposed for this specific project. I'll give you some examples. They can also include not only some publications related to their background and their role, but current and recently completed research projects or grants that they've been involved in. Positions, scientific appointments, and honors that they've received. These are just some examples. And then contributions to science. Up to 5 contributions to science, and within each of these up to 5 contributions to science can be included up to 4 publications or research products. So it doesn't have to be a peer-reviewed publication. It could be an abstract presented at a meeting. It could be a patent. It could be some other presentation. And then you can include a link to all of their publications. It must be a federal website. It cannot be a link to their lab's website or something like that. And so let me give you an example, and this is the new one, which will go into effect on May 25th. So the beginning part, let me say that everybody has to have an ERA NIH Commons username. If you don't have one, ask your institution to generate one for you. Here's section, well, this is their education and training. And then section A, where they talk about their background They have the expertise, previous projects they worked on. They also put in some private information or personal information. During 2015, 2016, my career was disrupted due to family obligations, however, upon returning and so forth. And they talk about their expertise and training that they can do the role on this specific project. They list 3 grants that they're involved in or recently involved in. 2 of them, they were in principal investigator. 1 of them, they were a co-investigator. And they list 4 publications that they want to highlight in this section A that are related to their background and their role in the project. Honors, positions, scientific appointments, and so forth. They say reverse order, which they mean is the latest at the top. And then different contributions to science. So up to 5 and up to 4 research products or publications that over the course, you don't have to do 5, but also their role in each of these projects and the findings, the significant findings in each of these projects. And here, as you can see, this is a government, it's an NIH website listing all of this individual's publications. So the budget, very quickly. Make sure that the budget matches what you're proposing. It's not padded, you're asking for too much, or you're asking for too little, and the reviewers will note that you don't understand the complexity of the project because you're not asking for significant funding. If there's any programmatic changes during the course of the 4 or 5 years, you need to bring on a biostatistician in year 3. You need to, in year 4, buy more animals or whatever. Make sure it's reflected in the budget that what you're asking for. These are the different categories in a detailed budget justification. As you can see, personnel, equipment, travel, other direct costs, including the subcontract, animals, patient care, and so forth. And then every institution has an indirect cost rate. Sometimes it's called facilities and administration. It's based on some aspect of the direct cost. Some institutions, you would ask your research administrators whether it's based on salary and wages or modified total direct cost, most but not all of the direct cost items. The system adds everything up for you in terms of your total budget. There would be a budget justification, make sure it's complete, comprehensive, concise, and calculated correctly. You need to include it. You need to include a description of each of the personnel, how much effort, 10%, 15% they're going to devote to the project. Make sure everything adds up. Make sure you address anything that goes up or down over the different years. So a number of years ago, NIH implemented what's called modular budgets, where you don't have to have a detailed budget if you're not asking for more than $250,000 a year. And you would ask, your direct cost budget would be in terms of up to 10 modules. Each module is $25,000. And you would determine what you need and whether you would go over the $250,000 or not. If any year goes over $250,000, then you can't use the modular budget. Many junior investigators, especially basic science or translational investigators, for their first R01, though it's not a requirement, use the modular budget. So you can see the budget page is much more simpler here. So here's an example. They asked for $250,000. Doesn't include the indirect costs of their subcontract. And there would be up to 3 budget justifications, separate budget justification. One, everybody has to do, which is justifying the personnel and talking about their background and percent effort, if they have a subcontract, or if they go up or down by one or two modules each year, because you need something special one year, or you don't need something, you don't need the biostatistician in year 4, and so forth. And lots of good URLs. that link to all of the information that I have proposed, that I've discussed. So finally, the last section, which is sort of an overall of how to take all the information that I just proposed and address. So you've identified the funding opportunity. It's an NIH R01 grant application. So I think that many times people just start writing. And I would say just to hold up a little bit and begin to prepare. It's not the will to win, but the will to prepare to win that makes the difference. So there are things that you can do that will help the competitiveness of your application as you prepare to write the application. Talk to the program officer of the funding agency. Speak to colleagues who have received an R01 grant. Ask to see their grant if possible. That would be very nice of them. Ask to see maybe the reviews that they get back. That would be especially nice of them. Make sure you understand the NIH review criteria, which I went into a lot of detail today. Make sure you understand the NIH's review process, which I went into a lot of detail today. Think about what will make the application more competitive. Do you need to bring in a special collaborator or co-investigator? Do you have all the core facilities or special research resources? What pilot data would help strengthen the application? Maybe you shouldn't go in for the next deadline. Maybe you should wait one cycle because you could generate so much more preliminary data. K applications and fellowships require confidential letters. Maybe there should be more than one PI, multiple principal investigator, as we discussed. What are the other institutions? Who are the other collaborators? How can you make the application multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary? Begin to meet with your co-investigators and collaborators and talk about what their roles and responsibilities would be involved. Are there any administrative aspects because other countries or institutions are involved? What are the core facilities that will support your research? Begin to meet with your research administrators to let them know about your application. Are there any regulatory issues like research with human subjects or laboratory animals? So it's at this point now that you've put all that in place that you can begin to write the grant application. As I've said, read the instructions, right? I told you this case where there was a problem with somebody's biosketch. Identify all the components of the application. My suggestion is to make a checklist. Airline pilots have checklists, I think. And then also, what's the order that you're going to complete each of these different items, right? You might have to do item number 6 before you can do item number 4 because you need the information from 6 to do 4 or whatever. Create an outline for each section. And then not only just a list of the topics you wanted to discuss, but how much space, if you will, each of those items is going to take up, right? Because almost every section has a page limit. So this, I'm going to cover this item, but it's going to be a paragraph. I'm going to cover this item, but it's only going to be 3 sentences or whatever. Begin to meet, as I said, with the different individuals and make sure that they know what their responsibilities are for the different aspects of the application, the biostatistician or whatever. Make sure you know the page limits. Okay, set up a schedule right now for all of the meetings. Nobody wants to find out, that they have 6 meetings coming up in the next 4 weeks. Set it up from now until the deadline. Even the sort of the boring things. So how are you going to name the files? Or there's a number of different allowed fonts. Which font are you going to use? Because you're going to be putting together sections and pages from different individuals and different components. You want things to flow as easily. Make sure that you have a firm timeline and all of your collaborators know the firm timeline for the sections that they are going to send you. Read the instructions, okay? When you're writing, never assume that the reviewers know what you mean. If it's important, say it. If it's important in more than one section, say it more than once. Refer to the literature thoroughly and thoughtfully. As a new investigator, you want to demonstrate to the reviewers that you know your field and you know the current state of the field and how your research is going to push that field forward. Explicitly state the rationale of the proposed project. Don't bury your lead. The hypothesis of my study is. Discuss any limitations, okay, as we discussed, or challenges, and the alternate approaches to mitigate these challenges. I think it's good to include well-designed tables and figures. Think about the reviewers who are reading page after page after page. If you create an outline, it will read in a very organized way. Have what I call pseudo reviewers review the grant for you and comment on it. And pseudo reviewers are not somebody in your research group, right, who know exactly what you're going to talk about. These are not pseudo reviewers because they've heard you talk about it. These would be individuals that sort of understand what you're talking about, but haven't heard it before. And then see the application from the reviewer's perspective and how all the different components flow from one to the other. In terms of well-designed tables and figures, I would say, you know, put some sort of caption along with the figure that helps explain what to the reviewers what's looking for. Figure 4 doesn't say anything, but you know, a title or a caption. Don't make it too complicated. Think about maybe they don't print it in black and white. If they are going to print it, it's easy for the reviewers to read. It's not too small. Realize that, you know, if the figure is too small and they can't see the importance of the data that you're presenting, it's not really helping you. If the font is too small and they can't really read what you've said about the figure or what the different lines are or the different panels are, it's not really helping you. You know, cutting and pasting a figure that you've used before from an oral presentation or a poster presentation where you're standing there talking about the figure, it might not be appropriate for a grant application. So some tips, you know, put the figure and the text on the same page so they can easily go from text to figure, and maybe make it bold so they can easily go from one to the other, and see the application from the reviewer's perspective and how the different components, even though you've uploaded or your research administrator has uploaded the components individually, how does it look to the reviewer in an integrated way? Maybe put in a timeline like this. Now this is 3 years, but you could do 4 or 5 years, demonstrating to the reviewers that you've thought about time-wise that the project can happen over the timeline of that particular grant. So, and also think about benchmarks or milestones so that you can measure that you're on the right path, if you will. So demonstrating to the reviewers that you really have thought about things at a very granular level, and you can keep track of whether you're on track, if you will. You expect to do these particular experiments by the 18 months, or you have acquired this particular research resource, unique research resource by month 6 or whatever it is. Make sure that you can say yes to all of these different points. Think about every question that a reviewer can have and answer them in your applications, not your PhD thesis defense. You're not in the room. You know, optional doesn't mean don't do the minimum. That request form that I mentioned, right? It's optional, but is there a reason not to do it? And think about what are the letters of support that would demonstrate to the reviewers that you have that research resource, that person is sending that cell line, that person is letting you use that unique piece of equipment. Fill the page, whatever it is. You know, you don't want it to look like you don't have anything more to say, but rather you have so much to say, you have to squeeze it into the page limit. I would say avoid what I call the 3 Ds, the day of deadline drama, right? You didn't include something, or you didn't have prepared a required component, or something that's not required, but definitely would have made the application more competitive. You just realize that in fact, your research meets the definition of research with human subjects. There's another human research compliance issue. There's a problem with the budget, it doesn't add up. You're missing a required signature that your institution, let's say, requires. Or for some reason, there's a problem with formatting. I faced all of these issues. Here's an example. Look at this. Urgent. Due at 5 p.m. today. This is an email that went out at 4:50. Okay, as a new investigator, all this should be yes. As besides funding, role models are important. I like this picture from just a few weeks ago. Role models are important. Mentors are important. Colleagues are important. Be open to new ideas and challenges. Take advantage of unique opportunities. Networking, when we can begin to travel again. Networking is important. Common problems from applications from new investigators. It doesn't address the application, doesn't address the funding agency's particular mission or budget limits or specific instructions. It's overly ambitious in so many different ways for the amount of time that's available, money that's available, the career level of the individual. These sort of three go together. It's a fishing expedition, just sort of collecting data. It's not really hypothesis driven. It's not looking at a mechanistic reason. It's too descriptive. It's good to have preliminary data or pilot data. It demonstrates the feasibility of the project as well as the scientific expertise of the investigative team. There's a problem with the study design, as I've mentioned, that NIH has this emphasis on rigor and reproducibility. You don't have the right control groups, or it's unfocused, or the right arms of the study. There's problems with the power analysis or the data analysis. Didn't adequately address access to research resources, or the budget doesn't match what's proposed. The methodology is beyond the expertise of the team, so bring in a collaborator, co-investigator. And especially important for junior investigators is demonstrating their independence from their previous mentor. So one summer I worked as a review administrator for NIH when grants were still on paper. And I wanted to see the mailroom, which was a pile and piles of FedEx boxes. So think about the fact that your grant is not there, but your grant is over there, and you've got to make it stand out compared to everybody else. Here's the review committee. So what are reviewers, what are they like? Well, they're very busy, right? They have their own grants. These are peer reviewers, right? Other faculty from across the country. They're not NIH employees. They have all their other responsibilities, their research group, their grants. So what do they do? It's sort of, well, there's some grants that definitely will get funded and others that probably will not. And there's the vast majority of grants in the middle, which are fine. And if there was an unlimited amount of money, they probably would get funded. But there isn't. So somehow the reviewers have to somehow differentiate between all these fine grants. So what do? They have to find something wrong. So there's something wrong with the statistics, the power analysis. So those grants go. Or there's some unique research resource that's not adequately described or discussed. So those go. It's, let's say, a career development grant and the research training part is not adequately discussed. Those goes. Or this one, the figure caption font is too, but it means that they can't see the main points that you're trying to make out of these great figures because it's too small or it's too busy, it's too complex. So those go. So in the end, you want to be the one where they couldn't find anything wrong with your grant so that you're going to get funded. And finally, good luck and thank you very much. And I think I'll stop sharing my screen. Realize it's a lot of material, but a lot of things to comprehensively address. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rubin. We have quite a number of questions in the Q&A, and if you would spare the 15 minutes that we have left.
I'm happy to, I'm not going anywhere.
Okay, great. And I just wanted to let the audience know we do have over 60 questions, so we'll do our best to respond to those in writing in a follow-up email with the recording of this webinar.
Sure.
So please look out for that as well in the coming days. So this one's from Christopher Rice. He wants to know, as a new investigator, is it always better to submit a modular budget versus a detailed budget?
So that's a very good question. You picked out a great question, Brady. I think it depends upon what your type of research. So many times individuals that do clinical research, it's very hard to fit all of that in $250,000. So it's really determined by the nature of your research. So you want to ask for a budget that adequately addresses what you're proposing with the idea of not being overly ambitious. But I have seen that it's very hard for new clinical investigators, if that's what type, to fit everything that they need in terms of their power analysis into $250,000.
Wonderful, thank you. This question's from an anonymous attendee. They will want to know if there's any discussion around ESI extensions due to COVID-19 delays.
I would check with their NIH program officer. I know in some cases there have been extensions with regard to the K99. I have to double check in terms of the ESI status.
Okay, and this is another question from an anonymous attendee. How long does it take to get the reviewer's comments?
It's usually,
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. So usually the study section meets about 3 months after the grant was submitted. Usually you'll get the score the next day. You'll sit there with hitting refresh, refresh, refresh to get the score, but you'll get the detailed reviewer's comments about 3 to 4 weeks afterwards.
Wonderful. This is another anonymous question regarding ESI. Is the 1-year extension for childbirth? In case of a second childbirth, will ESI status be further extended for a year if you already had it extended once for that first childbirth?
I would double check. This is sort of a new policy, and the childbirth has to be during that period of time.
Wonderful. This question is from Richard, and can you
Oh, sorry, let me just say one other thing. In NIH Commons, there is the process to request the extension. So within NIH Commons, you would request the extension.
Thank you. Can your application receive junior research status if you are beyond your 10-year mark, 13 years, but 2 years into your tenure?
So you're no longer an ESI. Some institutes have a different pay line for what they call NIs, or new investigators. So there's no time frame. It's just somebody who doesn't have or never had an NIH R01. So there's no time element. Some institutes will give a different pay line.
And then this is another question specific to the format from Sean. They would like to know if they should write the attachments as Word docs or in APA format or PDF when they submit.
So when you upload, it must be in PDF format. So individuals usually write, word processing program, Word or whatever, but the upload is a PDF.
Wonderful. This question is related to the data. Does preliminary data available have to be published, or can it be unpublished data?
No, it doesn't have to be published.
Okay. I'm sorry, doing my best to filter through questions.
No, I know, no, you're picking out very key questions.
Good. And there's quite a lot. So again, we'll do our best to answer all of these for you all. Can you briefly talk about disciplinaries between biosketch? Well, let me pick a different question. Sorry, that might be more specific.
Okay. I think while you're looking, let me just say that I think somebody just posted the URL for the policy for the extension, for COVID extension for ESI status. Let me just say, and Katie did also, somebody asked about IACUC and protocols at the time of application. So let me answer that with regard to IRB protocols. You do not need to have the IACUC or the IRB protocol approved at the time of application. Some people do, but you do not. If the grant is going to be awarded, they will request right before they make the award what's called just in time. And at that time, they will ask for documentation that the IRB or the IACUC protocol has been approved by your institution. You do not need it at the time of application.
Wonderful. This is a question from a new researcher. They're wondering if it's better to build up their publications before submitting any applications.
Well, I think it's a good question. I think it's a question of degrees. I mean, one wants to show the reviewers that in their previous research experiences, whether it's a graduate student or a postdoc or a second postdoc or whatever, they have been productive. They have published good papers in good journals, peer review papers, so that their previous research experiences have been productive. and have contributed to the scientific enterprise. It then gives the reviewers more confidence that this individual will continue on that path, if you will, that they will continue to be productive. And let me just continue and say that when you bring along co-investigators and collaborators to join your research group or to be collaborators or co-investigators, look to see that they've been productive also.
They followed up with, is there a specific number that they might be looking for of publications? Or...
I don't think there is a specific number. I think it's always better to focus on quality of publications as opposed to quantity.
Okay. Can you talk a bit about the educational components of involving graduate students in a research proposal?
So usually in a research proposal, graduate students are not considered key personnel. So you would not include their biosketch. Graduate students who are submitting a fellowship application, which we did not discuss today, would include a biosketch, and there's a special fellowship application. But usually graduate students are not considered key personnel, and so they would not have a biosketch.
Okay, I'm just trying to filter through some of these.
I know, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. This person is a PI, and they would like to know if you have official documents. Well, hold on, let's see. I'll just read the question to you. If PI gets a consultation from Trial Innovation Network, is there any approval process by program officer? And do you have to have official documents for the approval?
I can't address that question because I don't have experience with that area. I'm sorry.
Sure. Someone wants to know if co-PI is different from co-investigator.
So NIH does not use the term co-PI. So co-PI is not an NIH term. So one is either a PI or an MPI, or one is a co-investigator. There is no co-PI term. So that comes up frequently. Many times somebody will say, I'll make you a co-PI. There's no co-PI.
How do folks access the information regarding who will be reading their grant application so they can know their audience?
That's great. So as I said, many R01s are reviewed at the Center for Scientific Review. Go to the Center for Scientific Review's webpage. The study sections are grouped together for like similar research areas. Those are called IRGs, or integrated review groups. Within each integrated review group, there's maybe 10 or so individual study sections. And you can look up each of the study sections and it'll tell you the purview of the research interests that fall under the purview of that study section. They'll also tell you other similar study sections that review similar areas if this one is not the right one for you. You will also get a link to the reviewers on that study section. Do not contact the reviewers. It's only for informational purposes. Do not contact any of the reviewers. But if this is the right study section for you, maybe you recognize some of those names. Do not contact any of them. Also, one can go into NIH Reporter and look at grants that are funded, which is an NIH Reporter, and you can see which study sections reviewed those grants. So you can look up the titles of the grants. You can see if they're related to what you're proposing and what study sections reviewed these successful applications. And if you search by a particular study section and you get a bunch of grants that they don't look like they have and you can see the abstract also of these funded grants, and they don't look like they're proposing the same thing that you're proposing, it's probably not the right study section for you.
All right, this question asker wants to know if you can modify the title during resubmission.
So I think it can't be changed too much that you're really, this is one of the things to think about. If you're changing the application so much at a resubmission, the specific aims have changed so much, sometimes it's not a resubmission. Maybe it should be a new grant. if the change is so significant that the reviewers wanted such significant changes, one of the things to think about is maybe it's not a resubmission, maybe it's a new grant.
If the RO1 of interest says clinical trial is optional, can it be addressed and written as an RO1 without a clinical trial if you don't plan to do one?
Right, if it's optional, I mean, there's many permutations now. Sometimes there's only optional, no. If it's optional, you do not need to include a clinical trial.
Okay. Thank you. I think we're going to go ahead and end on that note. I have a few closing remarks, and just so
Okay,
the
please.
audience is aware, we will be doing our best to address all of your questions. I know we have a lot of specific ones here, so we will include that the unanswered questions in an email follow-up to you all. So I just wanted to thank, first of all, Dr. Rubin for joining us and your expertise. In addition to all of the questions and comments we're also getting a lot of praise for the important information that you're sharing today. So thank you so much for being here. And I
Thank
know
you,
that
my
everyone
pleasure.
here is very excited to get all of this information from you as well.
Thank you.
I also wanted to let you all know that we're recording this webinar and we'll be uploading it to our YouTube channel. So if you need to revisit any of Dr. Rubin's slides, you can do so there. We've also provided the link in the comments section to her webpage where you can find all of the information provided today. So please be on the lookout for the email. And Dr. Rubin, did you have any closing remarks before we end?
I just wanted to say good luck to everybody. Stay well.